Dear students, welcome to this video. Now in this video we are going to discuss about anchoring bias. Again, anchoring bias. This bias is very much relatable to our day-to-day life. Now without further delay, let's look at the formal definition of anchoring bias. Anchoring bias is a tendency to fixate or heavily rely on initial information and fail to adequately adjust for subsequent information. I know the definition is a little bit confusing. Don't worry, I'm going to explain it very soon and then I'm going to give you an example. Let's take a look at the keywords. Fixate or heavily rely on initial information. So that is what happens in anchoring bias. So when we start having information about something, usually what happens is we rely heavily on the first piece of information or the initial information. And as a result, we fail to adequately adjust for subsequent information. So simply speaking, we don't give much importance to the information that we gather later. We give too much emphasis or importance to the first piece of information or the initial information. Don't worry, I'm going to give you an example very soon. Now, before I move on to the examples, I just want to tell you why this bias is called anchoring bias. Let's take a look. Now, if you take a look here in this photo, here is a ship and here is the anchor of that ship, right? Now, I'm sure all of you remember what does an anchor do to a ship. The anchor actually stops the ship from moving to somewhere else. Or if I say it differently, it fixes the position of the ship in the sea. So again, it fixes the position. That is what is happening in anchoring bias as well. We fixate ourselves or anchor ourselves to the initial piece of information that we get. Again, we fixate ourselves or anchor ourselves to the first piece of information or initial information that we get. That's why it's called an anchoring bias. Now let me move on to the example. For the first example, we are going to do some shopping. I'm sure many of you love shopping, and I'm sure in the class there are many fashionistas. And trust me, those of you who do shopping regularly or sometimes, you have definitely fallen victim to anchoring bias. Let me explain to you how. So let's start the shopping process. Now for this shopping, let's assume that we are going to buy some dress. Now let's assume for this dress shopping, we are either going to Bosundhara City or Jomona Future Park or New Market. So we are going to visit two different shops, shop number 1 and shop number 2. So first, what we do is we enter shop number 1. So as soon as you enter shop number 1, you see that a certain dress is priced BDT 500. Again, you see that a certain dress is priced BDT 500. Now please remember, this is the first piece of information that you gather about the price of that dress. Now after moving around into that shop for some time, then you move on to the next shop, which is shop number 2. Now here you find out that the same dress or a similar kind of dress is priced at BDT 300. Now let's think for a moment. Naturally, as human beings, what we do? We start thinking something like this. The same dress was BDT 500 in the first shop. This one is much cheaper. So see what we are doing here? We are basically fixating ourselves or anchoring ourselves to the first price of the dress that we saw in shop number 1. So we are basically thinking in our mind that yes, this is the price that we saw in the first shop, and compared to that, this BDT 300 sounds like a really good bargain. The dress seems much cheaper now. This is exactly what happens. So even if you go into shop number 3, 4 or 5 later, most of the time we usually compare all the other prices to the price of the first dress that we saw in shop number 1. So again, basically we are fixating ourselves to the first price that we saw in shop number 1. And that is what we called anchoring bias. We are anchoring ourselves to the first piece of information that we got. Now, what is the problem with this bias? The problem is because we fixate ourselves or give too much importance to the first price that we saw, which is BDT 500, we start thinking that BDT 300 is a really good bargain. And very often we ultimately buy this dress, and after buying, something like this happens. We are really happy. Why? Because as a buyer, we start believing something like this. I bought these with BDT 300 only. সেই জিতছি. But this সেই জিতছি might be very wrong. Why? Because it might be very true that at the same time, the seller of the dress is thinking something else. What is the seller thinking? The seller might be thinking something like this. What a silly customer. The real price is only BDT 100. She could have negotiated much better. So see what happened? The actual price of the dress is much lower, which is BDT 100 only. But because of the anchoring bias, we did not negotiate with the seller very much. When we saw that the price of the dress is BDT 300, the customer was thinking that yes, ami jitsi. I am buying this dress at a much cheaper price because 300 seems much less compared to 500. So that's the problem with anchoring bias. So what should we have done here? Rather than anchoring ourselves or fixating ourselves with BDT 500 that we saw at the very beginning, we should have gone to some other shops as well and judged the quality of the dress objectively. In that case, maybe we could have understood that yes, the price of the dress should not have been 300, it could have been much less. We could have bought the dress at a much lower price than 300. So I guess by now the concept of anchoring bias is clear to you. Now let's move on to another organizational example. How anchoring bias may work in the organizational setting. So for this example, let's assume that we are sitting at a salary negotiation table. Again, salary negotiation table. So on the left hand side, we have the HR manager. And on the right hand side, we have the job candidate. So these two people are basically going to negotiate the salary. Now let's go through some conversations here. In that way, it will be easier for you to see how anchoring bias may work in the organizational setting. Now let's assume at the beginning of this conversation, the HR manager says something like this. How much salary do you expect? In response, the job candidate says something like this. BDT 30,000. Now this is the first piece of information that the HR manager heard from the job candidate. So this first piece of information works as the anchor. Again, this first piece of information works like the anchor for the HR manager. So what happens next? Based on this piece of information, the HR manager maybe says something like this. We will offer you 25,000. So see, when giving the job candidate the counter offer, the HR manager has not moved very much from the first piece of information. So he is thinking like, yes, the job candidate wants 30,000. So let's give him something near about 30,000, which is 25,000. So yes, in this case, the anchor is 30,000 taka. So the HR manager is basically anchoring himself to BDT 30,000 or giving relatively high importance on the first piece of information that he heard. Now let me give you the same example with different data. Let's take a look at the same example in a different manner. So here again we have the HR manager and then the job candidate, and at the very beginning of the conversation the HR manager asks something like this. How much salary do you expect? In response, this time the job candidate says something like this. BDT 15,000. Now what will happen? This time the anchor is basically BDT 15,000. And based on this piece of information, the HR manager says something like this. We will offer you 10,000 taka. So see, this time he is offering much lower. Why? Because the first piece of information says BDT 15,000 and the HR manager, when giving the counter offer, he is basing his offer on the initial 15,000 demanded by the job candidate. So here in this example, BDT 15,000 is the anchor. So that is how anchoring bias works in the organizational setting. So yes, we are done with the anchoring bias example. I hope the concept is clear to you. See you very soon in the next video with a new concept.